Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to MediaScope's live Friday chat. Today I'm really pleased to be joined by Dominic Pearman from Pearman Media. And this year, Pearman Media is celebrating its 20th anniversary. What a milestone. So I thought it was a good opportunity to get the founder and CEO of Pearman Media, Dominic Pearman, along, and we're going to have a talk about those 20 years. The changes that he's seen over that time, and indeed what it's like being a major indie media agency in a landscape that's increasingly full of holding companies. Dom, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. And the 20 years has gone like that, actually. It's gone very quickly.
Well, as you and I will talk about, we met before that 20 years, and we'll touch on that first in a moment. But first of all, I suppose to anchor our chat for the next 45 minutes or so, I think it would be great just to get your idea or your top line kind of overview of the market in general, certainly the challenges, but also the green shoots.
I guess, from my point of view, the market is I mean, if you're talking about, it's going well in terms of, I've got no issues. Clearly digital is absolutely the place where we're all learning so much, and that seems to be the constant area where definitely I'm learning. That's for sure. We've got a dedicated digital department, and I'm learning most from that. And I guess from years gone by, the market is now so fragmented, so that makes a bit of a difference in the planning as well.
So challenges around planning. And what about any green shoots, Dom? You noticed, you said that there's certainly businesses in the digital sector. What are the green shoots specifically that you see in that sector? Are we talking programmatic? Are we talking a shift to video?
Well, clearly everything's shifting to programmatic anyway. The video shift has come anyway, and clearly there's also there's a lot of debate about whether or not display advertising is effective or not on digital, but programmatic is naturally the place where most clients sort of veer towards, mainly because it's so accountable, I guess. When you talk green shoots, I'm not sure exactly what you mean in terms of anything coming up, but Snapchat's obviously something which is on our radar to see how that's performing. But again, as we were talking about before, it all comes down to whether or not it's effective. In terms of TV or it just fragmentation just hit us so hard compared to 20 years ago.
Yeah. And perhaps that's a nice segue into the next thing that I want to touch on. As we kind of said, you and I met even before you started Pearman Media. You were a younger person, as I was back at DMB&B. Was it Darcy, Macias, Benton and Bowles?
Yes, and then they actually merged with Weeks Morris Osborne.
That's right.
His name, and the poor receptionist had to say, "Good morning, Darcy, Macias, Benton and Bowles, Weeks Morris Osborne."
That's
surprised clients have stayed online by the time she got that out.
That's right, I do remember. And you had offices in the jam factory at Surrey Hills.
That's right, yeah, that's right. I was working on Westpac at that stage.
Yes, and the client that you still have today, I recall, which is Hamburg Sud. And I want to touch on that in a moment. But I suppose it would be good just, thinking back to those earlier days when you and I first met. As I said in MediaScope's newsletter this morning, I was a very green rep working, I think, for Personal Investment magazine.
BRW as well?
BRW as well, yes. So, all kind of merged into one, which is obviously why we were talking about Westpac. But really, I suppose, wanted to get a view from you of what do you remember about those earlier days around that time when you were at DMB&B WMO?
Probably going back even earlier. So I started in 1980, and Leo Burnett was where I started for 6 years. It was about the third largest agency in Australia, and probably what I remember most was it was actually pretty much a boys' club. It was run by a guy called Alan Scash, and we seemed to have, a lot more things went on, which you and I talked about as well, Denise, which we can't talk about here. So, that's sort of, but frankly, I've been in advertising for 30 odd years, and I've enjoyed pretty much every year. So they're all different for different reasons. But in the earlier days, certainly there wasn't the accountability that there is today in terms of what clients are expecting. There was possibly a bit more fun, maybe, fairly relaxed at work, although I still believe we are fairly relaxed here. And it was, media agencies hadn't really taken off. I think there was Mitchell's and Merchants, that was it. So it was all the media department in with the creative agency, which I actually really enjoyed. And I remember thinking I'd never worked for a media agency, but here I am. Yeah. And the good thing there was with, say, with Westpac, or even I then went and worked on Unilever, you sort of lived and breathed the brand, and you basically, you got to understand it really well. So on Westpac, we worked closely with the suits and the creatives, and that was something that, I really enjoyed that part of it. It also probably meant that the job was a bit less stable as well, because I remember sort of on Westpac, there seems to be constant, talk of, the Westpac account was shaky, and clearly, if we'd lost Westpac, then I would have been out of a job.
Yes, and actually speaking to you today actually made me count how many years I had been in the industry, and I got to 33 and just kind of thought, oh my God. So, I started pretty well straight out of school, and just went straight into a media business. And agree with you, loved working for full service agencies in those early days. Conahan and May was certainly, was a really well-known agency, got bought by Leo Burnett eventually. But
you had different characters in there, didn't you? You had sort of a whole raft of different characters, because you had the creatives and the suits and the accounts people. It was sort of, there just seemed to be a lot more characters in there.
Definitely. And, us being in media, being with the suits and with the creatives, you're right, you understood your place in the process a lot more, I think.
But having said that, media wasn't as important back then either. Whereas now you actually probably have a more of a contact with the clients compared to way back when.
Yes, I think that's really true. I mean, media now is known to be leading the marketing conversation in so many ways, whereas before it was always creative. So it also seemed to me to be, I hate using the word simpler, but, outdoor was probably about as exciting as it got. It was a pretty, a pretty defined landscape, certainly compared to what it was. Having said that, as you said, you really you developed great relationships with your media people, media reps, really understood the media that you were investing in, understood the clients that you were investing for, perhaps not as much these days. So
you say it's simpler, and it probably was, but I mean, I remember sort of buying the TV campaign. You'd have to go to a separate rep in Perth. You'd have to go to a separate rep in Adelaide. Even with outdoor, there was a good sort of 3 or 4 outdoor players. If not, there was actually quite a few more. Radio, there wasn't the the network radio station, so you'd have to go to a lot more reps. So it was simpler probably because there was possibly less accountability, and you just reach a lot more people a lot quickly. The Sunday night roadblock. Correct, that's right. And then you've done your jobs.
And then you've done your job. And, thinking back to those days, I mean, gosh, Lou Barrett, who's now GM of, Channel 10, used to give me my pre-telecast times, I think, for one of the Channel 9 regional or, interstate stations. So it's certainly, that's, I think, been part of the joy of being in the industry for so long, is that, you've developed these good relationships that you've kind of followed and kept over the years. Some people like you and Lou Barrett and so on have really just gone on to, such great and good things. So, As I said, that's been one of the joys of being in the industry for so long. So let's perhaps now talk about the early days of Pearman Media. And I really want to get a sense of, why you started an independent media agency. I mean, as you said, there weren't too many media agencies, solo media agencies around back then. You highlighted Mitchell's. AIS would be another one that would perhaps pop to my mind.
Yep.
What made you make that move? And, and you took along your foundation client who's still with you today.
Yeah, well, as I said, it's funny because I actually, I spent 16 odd years working at large, multinational creative agencies, within the agency working with the creatives. And I even remember saying to myself, I would hate to work for a media agency. However, after about 16 years, I'd been quite lucky because I hadn't got retrenched from anywhere. And I was working on Unilever at Lintas, and it was split between Lintas and JWT. And my luck ran out back in 1996, where you could argue the luck came my way, but we lost the account, the Unilever account. I was retrenched for the first time in my advertising career after about 16 years, and I guess I looked around. I was about 33 at the time, and probably the closest I've come to thinking I'm an elite sportsman. But I looked around a bit like a sportsman, going, "Gee, most people I'm with on this team are younger. They're all sort of towards. I was getting towards the older age group, and then the other thing was I looked around, and clearly, advertising is a bit of a pyramid, system whereby most of the people were running agencies in their mid to late 30s. So I actually thought of it as a potential way for me to buy myself a job. That's pretty much what I thought. When I got retrenched, I didn't bother looking for another job, but I thought, this industry is sort of a young person's industry. I was very fortunate on a couple of aspects. One was I didn't really have any major commitments. I didn't have a wife. I didn't have any kids. It was pretty much me. And I also had, as you said, this client called Hamburg Sud who'd followed me around from an agency called Luscombe & Partners, and I went to DMB&B Weeksmore. So I was born to work on Westpac, and then Lintas to work on Unilever. And both times the client followed me, and it was sort of something I used to do at night after I'd spent my day working on Westpac, and I didn't get paid any extra for it or anything like that. But when I got retrenched from Lintas and thought about sort of opening up my own shingle, Hamburg Sud said they would happily come and be my founding client. So it was that was pretty much how it worked. After about a year, I worked at home and just to keep my costs down. And after a year, I'd probably put on 4 or 5 other clients, and then a guy called Ben Aliff, who is here now, and I'd worked with at Lintas on Unilever. He'd survived the cut, but he was keen to come across, and so he came across to work with me for a year in my house. And I remember we used to go down to the beach at lunchtime and look around and think, what are all these people doing? Why aren't they working? But I'm sure they were looking at us as well. And then from there, it's grown. It's grown sort of steadily, and we built about 190 clients last year, and we've slowly added all the bells and whistles. So we have the Roy Morgan sort of attitudes and lifestyles. We have the OzTam minute by minute data. So all those things, we have a digital department. They all cost, but because of the 20 years we've been in existence, we've now pretty much got most of the bells and whistles that any large agency has, which puts us in a really good position.
Can I ask just a quick question that perhaps a few people are thinking that are watching us? What does Hamburg Sud do?
Hamburg Sud, they are a shipping line. They're from the Oetker family in Germany. The Oetker family could buy out, at that time, could have bought Kerry Packer 20 times over. They own beer, they own supermarkets, and they ship around the world. So the beauty was I was looking after the Australian media as well as the US and New Zealand. So never been a massive client, but it was big enough for me to think, well, I've gone from a salary from here to pretty much not a lot, but I could survive because I didn't have too many overheads.
And I think that's a real testament to you, Dom, that they're still with you. You know, they've followed you from place to place, but are still a client 20 years on. I can't think of another client agency relationship that would be that way. So, you know, I think that's a real testament to you. So well done.
Thank you.
How many people on staff now?
There's 20.
There's 20 of you. And as you said, a digital department. What about the programmatic? Have you got a trading desk in place? How does
Yep. We've just started that this year.
Yep.
So it's, it's all going well.
Yep, excellent. And of course, over that 20 years, you would have noticed a huge change in the media agency and agency landscape that you operate in.
Yep.
Certainly the incoming holding companies that have slowly but surely either brought their own brands in or bought Australian brands and merged. I suppose Match Media is one that comes to mind that happened last year, bought by, I think, one of the Publicis holding company, I could be wrong there, and Mercer Bell on the creative agency side also being bought up, I think, earlier this year. So I suppose wanted to get a sense from you on what it's like being an independent and one of the largest independent media agencies in Australia, and what it's like operating in a landscape that is increasingly dominated by those holding companies. Yeah,
I think it's great. I think we're in a great position. I know for a fact that these holding companies have enormous pressure on them for a return on investment. I think what that means is that we've seen some of the companies become sellers of media and buyers, so that they have their own programmatic vendors or they have their own ad platforms, and I guess what that leads to is, if I was a client, and again, maybe I'm deliberately looking on the darker side, but if I was a client, I'd be worried about the transparency where the advice is coming from, and obviously we've seen some of that transparency issues a year or two back. But certainly from here, we always talk about we've got to make sure that we treat this money like our own, and that we're giving our clients the best possible unbiased advice. So we're not directing them to a certain media because we get more commission from it or anything like that. I think there's fewer entities or holding companies than there are to clients. So that leads to client conflicts. In other words, there's a lot more car companies, auto companies than there are holding companies. There's more insurance companies than there are holding companies. So I think generally there's potentially questions over transparency. I think, and I guess I hope, that the fallout from that means that people like us are in a good position. We often pick up clients who have are dissatisfied with the service they've been given, the philosophy here is very much a work-life balance. I'm pretty much the last person to leave every night at about 6 or 5:45, but we absolutely seem to be able to service our clients, even though that and when I say we have 190, some of the clients are through other agencies that bill through us, so it's not as if we have to service every 190 client.
Yeah.
But so I think we're in a good position. I think just because you're bigger doesn't mean that you can actually satisfy your clients better.
Yeah. And as you said, John, certainly that trust, that word trust has been really, come to the forefront in the media trading process, in the media trading structure. Certainly over the last few years, I think it's always been there. I mean, even though it kind of all blew up, about 18 months, 2 years ago, we've all known, what's been going on. It's still, it's still something that's being discussed. I thought it was great that it got out in the open and it was being spoken about very honestly. As you said, I think it gives you, gives independent media agencies a really, really strong position in the landscape.
Yeah, and I assume that most independent agencies probably have a greater tenure of staff as well. Like I can't back that up with figures, but certainly we've got people who have been here for 19 years, 16 years, 14 years, 10 years, and that's going to benefit clients as well if they have a consistent person working on their business. Then that helps too.
And you're right, that churn, staff churn, and plus also perhaps the inexperienced staff that are sometimes working on quite large pieces of business is something that is raised often as well. And you're right, perhaps not so prevalent in an agency such as yours, where it is regarded as the keep me up at night issue by a lot of the major agencies, is they just can't get the right skills and the right people, and then getting them to stay in the agency is the other thing. And certainly clients don't like that constant change of I'm going to a meeting today with the agency, I'm not too sure who's going to be there today. Very good. Let's now perhaps drill down over those long years, Dom, that you and I have been involved in media.
You make me feel older.
We're not. Maybe in our industry, but as I also said to you over the last few days as we were preparing for today, and you agreed, I walk into a room so often now where I am the oldest in the room.
Yes.
My mantra, or how I kind of deal with that, is I just think passion is ageless. I'm just going to go in there and ask lots of questions and be really friendly and show my interest and show my passion. And I actually really enjoy now being the oldest in the room. It's such a joy to have been in the industry for so long. But really wanted to, talk to you about the specific changes that you've seen in the media trading process over those 20 years. And, we kind of touched on it before, that it was a bit of a simpler landscape, perhaps, not so much the emphasis on accountability, but anything specifically that you've seen, also perhaps with the shift to owned and earned media.
Yeah. I think if you take the again, getting back to the fragmentation of the media, like a TV rating 20 years ago, 16% was considered, a good rating, and it was sort of, up there with the top, within the tops of rating programs. Whereas now, if you're getting 8, that's considered a good, rating. Magazines, top 3 magazines, certainly women's magazines, they've halved. Cinemas have doubled. So there's a lot more areas, and obviously with digital coming on board, then everything's fragmented. I think from a planning point of view, it's probably more complex. We talked about how simple it was previously, that you could put a Sunday night roadblock and then you've sort of done your job. I think these days there's a lot more research tools, which is great. There's client data as well, which is fantastic if you can overlay that. Not all clients share their data, but where you can, and that's fantastic. But also there's, as I've mentioned, there's far few media vendors. So to actually, when you get into the buying, it's actually that's simpler as well, being a single point of contact. It definitely is a buyer's market. That's something which is I've seen change over the 20 years. It's and I think it will be continuously with such fragmentation. We can always go to another media vendor and still achieve what we need to achieve. So it really does seem to be a heavy buyer's market, which is making a bit of a mockery of rate cards because the discounts are so far off all the rate cards. And again, it's in terms of owned and earned, probably it doesn't really affect us with our clients. I think that's more your $10 million type clients. But I'm still, I'm a firm believer that digital delivers it doesn't drive. And we've seen that across the board when you do a television campaign, the Google Analytics go berserk because obviously the TV is driving people to search or go online. The owned and earned, I'm yet to see evidence that that's made a massive difference to a client's bottom line. So it's not something that a lot of our clients, get heavily involved in. And I think it's more if you've got a $10 million client, they can afford to take, $200,000 and try something a little bit different.
What about the incoming media, such as, I've been listening, I'll talk about this a bit later, but I've been listening to, what a nerd I am, but I've been listening to the Senate inquiry today on media reform. I've had it going in the background, which is obviously something that will impact our industry if it ever happens. I'm still not convinced it's going to happen quickly. But certainly, they're talking a lot today about, the Facebooks and the Googles and, the Twitters and the Snapchats, I think was also mentioned. You mentioned that earlier. All of these huge international media businesses that are now coming in and really taking, a huge chunk of that advertising spend. How has that impacted the landscape that you operate in now?
Obviously it's impacted the print area more than anything. Clearly it's taken a bit from TV, but TV's still, holding up, but holding up from years ago, the same level of spend.
Yeah.
From what I've seen, I think that it just means that, and that's why we have to have a digital department to be able to, cope with all that. But I haven't had one client turn off all their offline media and put it all online, and then they've come back and reinvested in offline. So it's sort of digital clearly, is a requirement for all clients, but it's a matter of what proportion. The hard part these days is obviously you need to take such a holistic view of everything. And, I always go back to when you were a media planner back in 1956, of which I wasn't there, but you would have been an expert in radio and print, and suddenly this new fandangled thing called television came along, and you'd go, how does this fit in? I think clearly, digital is more complex again, and it's accountable, but it's just a matter of determining what's actually driving people to do whatever thing you need them to do, whether it be buy the product or building the brand. It's impacted. I think it's impacted basically, meaning that it's a little bit more complex to plan advertising.
But as you said, John, really, that's never changed. Is you look at the objectives of the client. That has never changed, even since 1956, and I wasn't around then either. But now it just seems the platforms have changed. I also wonder too, as an industry, I've certainly noticed this maybe in the last 10 years. I think we've been very guilty of shiny object syndrome. And your client that pulled all out of traditional media, just going into digital media, and then now has sort of come back in. I think we've lately been a little guilty of, all thinking social media, it's all social media, it's all digital, it's all programmatic. And group buying is always, the thing that I think of when I think of shiny object syndrome. That was just the biggest bright shining star that crashed to earth incredibly quickly. But there are an enormous amount of group buying businesses that launched into our market and seem to just come and go almost overnight.
Well, I definitely agree that the amount of, say, trade press coverage of digital is completely disproportionate with the role that digital does play in the landscape. I think social is great, but it's never going to drive a business. Social normally is my view is that you can build a small business using digital, and it makes sense because it's the most cost-effective way of spending some money. But if you actually want to build it into a big business, you need to look further afield as well. The social is there's a professor in Melbourne, I've forgotten his name, but who gave a great speech about social media, and he pointed out that number of clients, such as say Woolworths customers, who actually get reached by social is 0 point something, and it always tends to be 0 point something.
Yep.
If you've got a very large client with obviously if you've got a particular fashion brand or something like that, then that can make a difference.
Yep.
So.
All part of the mix. And Dom, with the changes that you've seen, no doubt the skill sets of the 20 that you're now employing, and indeed, the skills of, people like me that have been, you and I that have been doing this for such a long time, we've really had to, evolve our skills and evolve our knowledge. So what's the makeup now of the skill sets within the 20 that you now have in the agency, and how has that changed over the years?
Well, I still think that it's a people business.
Yep.
And that's frankly what I enjoy about advertising. It is reasonably relaxed, and it's relationships. And I've seen, without doubt, if you've got good relationships with people in general, whether it be the clients or whether it be the media, you're going to get a better result. So one thing I've learned about running a business is everybody has different skill sets, and as a business owner, I need to put the right people in the right seat on the bus. Yeah. And if you can do that, then you're sort of you're utilising the skill set that person has. From my point of view, as I said before, you need more of a holistic view of it. Analytical probably is a good thing to have these days compared to previously. But also, as far as I understand, certainly in larger media agencies, multinationals, the skill sets are hived off into different departments. So you might just be buying outdoor media, or you might just be buying TV. So probably in a smaller agency such as us, your skills need to be a bit more broad, and you probably learn a lot more, but not as an expert in TV or outdoor as you would be sort of in a large multinational agency. But it's sort of the post-analysis has probably become more complicated because with clients all want to know about attribution, and that basically means that I think the skills are, sorry, I'm raving, but I think the skills are still the same in terms of the personalities, in terms of the people who will do well in the business, are normally fairly sharp, normally fairly friendly and amenable. But it's probably more to know in terms of analysis of data and then also the attribution. Right.
And I suppose as I'm, really deep diving a little bit into the skill shortages issue of the industry, I'm really coming up with, exactly that. We're still such a people-orientated industry. Probably not unlike other industries, but even though, we're increasingly turning to these more automated platforms, it is still unbelievable how resource-heavy those platforms are to operate. So, that's something that I've really picked up in my journey. But I agree, overall it does seem to be more, that attribution and that accountability is certainly, at the forefront of everything that we're doing now. And those kind of analytic skills are good. And, like you, I really like the thought of a smaller agency where you get to work across multiple media, instead of being very siloed, which is perhaps what could happen in a larger agency. Perhaps, not always, but perhaps what could happen in a larger agency.
Yeah. I mean, one thing about the larger agencies, and maybe I'm being critical, but is I think, and you talked about digital, the exposure it gets, and how it's talked about, that shiny toy sort of thing. I think the struggle that probably most of us had when digital first came on board was, how do we become experts in this area? And then when digital first came on board, there were quite a few companies that set themselves up as just digital-only companies. There's fewer of those now, as the multinationals took it in-house. And then the struggle was, how do we actually make money out of it? Because digital is quite more work-intensive than booking a TV campaign or even or a radio campaign. And the danger we've got there is programmatic is highly profitable for companies, and so you don't want to think that that's being pushed just because that's where they're making enormous amount of money.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. Out of interest, Dom, are you moving into buying those more traditional medias through programmatic channels? So TV, radio starting a little bit out, probably digital out of home.
Funnily enough, you've touched on my bugbear because, as I'm sure my staff will be laughing at the moment, but my belief of programmatic is programmatic was programmatically fine-tuning a schedule based on an outcome. So whether it be a click-through rate or whatever, then these computers all sort of work out where to feed the advertising based on whatever model's been put in. I can't see TV. It's not really programmatic because you're not getting a direct response that you can measure straight away and then move activity that way. Until TV becomes well and truly hooked onto the internet, where most houses have TV connected to the net, then it's going to be very hard to sort of programmatically buy it.
Yeah.
So no, we haven't really moved into programmatic buying of radio or TV or
Well, yeah, but
I mean certainly the combination of data, and client data and the TV ratings.
Yes,
that's great, but it's not what I think is programmatic in how I've been brought up to believe it in the last few years.
I know what you mean. That kind of real time informed buying. Yep, I know what you mean. Let's also just touch on, before we kind of move on to another quick area, I want to get a sense too of how clients have changed over the years. Are they? I mean, we've already touched on the fact that there's more emphasis on accountability and attribution, but how have they changed over the years when you're dealing with them?
I think clients have probably changed along with most businesses, whereby they want immediate outcomes. They want it's all about sort of short-term outcomes. Possibly also clients aren't in their job for as long as people used to be, and that goes for businesses per se. CEOs aren't in their jobs for as long as they used to be. You get career CEOs who come in for 3 years and move on. So that's probably been the biggest. And with Hamburg Sud, for instance, the guy that we deal with, a guy called Trevor Brentner, who's sort of their marketing arm, he's still there. So that consistency is probably what makes a difference in terms of relationships and things like that.
Yeah.
We never used to talk about response or it's probably a bad thing, but we never used to talk about sort of short-term outcomes. When we were years gone by, I was working on British Paints or Lotto, and it was more just people just accepted advertising because they felt it would build a brand, and that was sort of good enough back then. But not too many clients are happy to say, well, I want to build a brand, and I'm going to hang around for 5 years, and my CEO is going to support me for 5 years. My board's going to support me, and I'm just going to plough this money into building this brand. We've had a number of cases where we've had to put up a case to the board of why it's worthwhile spending money on advertising, and that's probably something I don't ever remember doing. Sort of 30 years ago, it was just a given that they would be spending X amount because they felt it was going to be help build a brand.
Well, that 50% saying kind of comes to mind. 50% of my advertising is working. I just don't know which one. And it does, I mean, as you said, it does. Now with that emphasis on accountability, ROI, attribution, it does seem bizarre when you think about it that didn't seem to be such a huge issue. I wonder if the accountability of digital being, I think, both friend and foe to that channel, has taught clients to ask for that in all other channels as well, or had that expectation in all other channels as well.
Probably, yeah. I mean, I tend to think digital shoots itself in the foot by being so accountable. I love all this attribution modelling that digital does, but it just does it on its own. So it excludes the fact that you've got a TV campaign running, or excludes the fact that you've got radio or outdoor. We've always talked about here that obviously advertising is more an art than a science, and as much as we try, it is very hard to measure the impact that somebody's had if they've seen an outdoor poster whilst coming to via the train station, heard a radio ad, and then they clicked online to something. Now, what we often see is the click-throughs online often tend to be Monday, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and that to me is telling me that people are making decisions on the weekend. And then they come to work and they're doing their research at work. But I just think it's wrong to just isolate that and just say, well, that's only when our client, so that last click attribution, it won't work if there's other media around. If all you're doing is digital, then yep, absolutely that works.
Yep. And I always think too, the other part of the puzzle, the success puzzle, I suppose, in any campaign is the creative, which we, as media people, we just don't, even though perhaps through the planning process and the strategy process, we can inform, what the creative should or can say. That at the end of the day is such a huge part on getting someone to click.
Yeah, absolutely. That's possibly been overlooked because of this sole focus on click-through rates or what a digital campaign actually achieved.
Yeah. Look, the other thing that I always think is never spoken about is the product good? You think about Brute. Brute has very famous advertising campaigns, but the product's still shit. So sorry to anyone who might have Brute on right now. But famous advertising campaigns. Of recent, but it's still a pretty rotten product.
Well, what we can do with, back to the creative is obviously you run different types of creative, digitally, and then you can fine tune that, and then you do know. So you do have a combination of the creative plus the digital platform you're using.
Yep.
We've done that in the past, and we've seen that certain, creative messages will achieve better results than others. So that works.
Yep.
But whether or not how you judge a TV commercial, whether it's been effective or not, purely on the creative side, can be difficult. Very difficult.
All right, let's move on now, and just we've only really got a few more minutes, so just wanted to get your sort of view on what's going on in 2016. And as you know, John, for the past few years, I've produced a predictions article where I've gone to people from all channels in our market. And I've asked them to share their predictions at the start of the year, but I also asked you to come in and make a quick comment at the halfway mark. And it's turned into this really quite well-known and quite well-referred to, predictions article for our Australian market. But just, now that we're nearly at the end of April, my God, how did that happen? But wanted to get an idea from you on how you think 2016 is going.
Yep. Okay. I guess I looked at a few things. I looked at the SMI data, which probably accounts for about 85% of all the income media are getting. We talk to our clients, see how they're travelling. Generally, I believe most of my clients are travelling quite well. There's not sort of they're not doing cartwheels, but also they're not sort of slitting their wrists. At the moment, and as I've said in my forecast, clearly, and if you look at it, it's all just, if you increase 5% on last year, that's a good year.
Yep.
But it depends on what happened last year, this year we're going to have an election and the Olympics, and clearly that's going to involve more clients spending, certainly the larger clients spending more money. So that's going to pretty much make sure that this year's probably going to be better than last year. Based on SMI, that hasn't happened just yet. We're still about -2% overall. The media that are doing well, like outdoor, radio, cinema, continue doing well. TV is not going great at the moment, but again, once the elections and once the Olympics kick in, I'm no prizes for assuming that they're going to do well. I also look at the economic situation, and I've got a financial advisor that I go to and say, tell me what's happening. But you get conflicting advice. So sometimes 1 week they're going, well, consumer confidence is up, and the next week consumer confidence is down. Generally, it seems to be that Australia's weathered any sort of external international issues quite well. So if you think that we are going on a reasonable track financially, then that reflects that'll reflect how business is generally going. So I think I went out on a limb, and I think that I said that it was going to advertising will increase by about 5+% this year. And although that's not looking good after the first 3 months, I still believe that we'll end up as a reasonably good year.
Yes, and I think I kind of said pretty well the predictions for 2016 were based on quite a positive outlook. And certainly that was very much fueled by the election, both here and the US. We forget, well, actually, how could you forget that there was an election in the US? But, the Olympics as well, which is happening soon. I must admit, I'm now starting to think, my goodness, 2017, I think might be the year that catches up with us a little. But perhaps that's a conversation for another day without those, those big events to really boost this year. But
remembering, it's been very flat over the last few years. I think last year was up about 4%, 5%, but a few years before that, the advertising spend was reasonably flat. But overall, the market does seem to grow each year in terms of the pie, that advertising pie. Clearly, a good proportion of that's now going digitally.
Yep.
But I personally haven't seen too many clients come and say, we've got to cut our advertising.
Yeah, well, that's good. And, we always forget too that a good proportion of that digital spend goes to Google and Facebook. So it's not really going to perhaps the publishers,
Yeah, but if you look at also who the big players are online, it's MI9, News, Fairfax. So they still are getting, although they're losing a bucket load of money in the print, they're still bringing in money via digitally.
Mm. It'll be very interesting to see how, as always, it'll be very interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah.
To finish up, Dom, I always ask a question toward the end of every chat, and just to get a sense of what's been on your radar this week and anything particularly for next week.
Okay. Well, we've bought a direct response agency, and we've got a half share in a direct response agency, and part of that, I'm actually going to London in June, so I basically sat down and talked about how that's going. And the other thing on my radar is getting some jackets for my daughter's football team, which I coach. They're called the Flamingos, and basically organised some pink jackets for them. What I've got to do is I've got to make sure I spend more time sort of working on the business rather than the personal side of things. But I've stepped back into the media more just recently, and that's something I'm really enjoying as well. So I'm playing media manager, or I think we call them account directors these days, I'm not sure. But both my media director and my media manager are on maternity leave. I've stepped back into the role of physically planning and buying advertising space, and I'm really enjoying it. So.
Great, that's good. And you touched on it, the work-life balance. So I'm pleased to hear that you're taking care of your home life, Dom.
Yes, actually, I think we had a masseuse this week as well come into the office and give everybody massages. so that's sort of part of the work-life balance also.
Excellent, very good. For me, on my radar this week, I think I mentioned before, I've been listening in the background to the Senate committee inquiry on media reform. It was great to see Megan Brownlow actually give a submission. Megan from PricewaterhouseCoopers, who I know well. So that just, to me, media reform. my goodness, I mean, how many times can we go around in this circle? I'm sure that the Senate committee isn't hearing anything that they've not heard before. It just seems to me that we're perhaps not any closer. So that'll be interesting. I also this week attended ADMA's Data Day. That was down at Luna Park. And that was a day full of basically looking at how data influences every single point on the customer journey, from from what we would regard as measuring paid advertising to optimising a mobile phone call to the client at the client service desk. It really was an interesting day, and ADMA, of course, always gets some really good speakers involved. There's a few things going on with me behind the scenes with my NBN initiatives, and I'll hopefully have some more talk about that, or some more news about that in the coming weeks. But as always, keeping myself very busy and very interested in a busy landscape. But thank you, Dom, so much for joining me. I should say happy 20th birthday.
I haven't been 20 for a while, but thank you very much.
That is a pleasure. And, as I said, an absolute testament, to you and your team, that you've managed in such a fast-moving, volatile landscape. You've managed to keep your business going for 20 years and, keep your business going successfully for 20 years. So well done to you. And I really want to say thanks so much for joining me today and just having a chat about the landscape and about your journey and so on. But more than anything, wanted to recognise, your great achievement.
Great. Well, thank you, and thanks a lot for having me on. It's been great.
Terrific. We'll